Hello, everybody, and good morning to you. You are very welcome to this Transitioning Back to the Workplace webinar hosted by Enterprise Ireland in these incredibly weird and challenging times that we find ourselves in. It's really unusual to be back to where we are now, which is going back into the office, going back where we have all kind of been used to and felt safe before, but all of a sudden it's all very different. And that which was familiar before now seems that little bit distant and that little bit odd. And while every organization is unique with the challenges they are faced, there are really common themes that are going throughout every business and every organization. We're going to be touching on those throughout the course of this morning's event. It is an interactive event, so we do want you to get involved. If you look at the screen on the panel, you're going to see the question section. So if you click on that question section, then you're going to be able to put questions through to me that I will ask our panelists as we go through the morning. I mean, just even the office that I'm in here, which is my office here in Republic of Work in Cork, if you come in, you can only go up one stairs and down another stairs. The kitchen is closed. Everybody's kind of just that little bit anxious. It's a weird environment, but hey, it's reflective of the last couple of months that we've put down, and at least we're in the position where we can go back to the office, albeit in unusual circumstances. So let's have a look at the agenda and what we're going to be talking about throughout this morning at this webinar. We're going to have an introduction and overview of people and HR challenges that have arisen as a result of COVID-19. We're going to review those key challenges as well. So areas like employee health, safety and well-being. There's a lot of anxiety amongst the workforce right now. How do you deal with that? Employee communications and engagement. How do you make sure that when rules are there, they're fully understood and that they are implemented? Resource planning, a key challenge for a lot of companies right now, given that they don't know the landscape and what might happen next. And it hasn't gone away, you know, GDPR and data security. We'll talk about how you can manage that when everybody isn't in the same place that they were at the start of the year. There's a lot of support out there from Enterprise Ireland. We'll go through what that support is and how you can access it. We'll have our questions and answer, and we'll have a wrap up at the end. So who, I hear you ask, is going to be on our panel this morning? Well, we have got some fantastic experts from Voltedge. We have the joint managing directors, Fredericka, Sheppard and Joyce, Rigby. For those of you who aren't familiar with Voltedge, they're an expert HR consultancy. They have been working with over 20 consultants on a lot of different areas. So they mightn't necessarily have realized that they were fully prepared to give advice in a COVID pandemic. But guess what? The advice that they've accrued has become very, very useful. And also, we've got Karen Hernandez, who's a senior executive with Enterprise Ireland in the area of people and management. And she's going to go through not just the issues that have been thrown up for EI companies, but also we're going to talk with Karen about those supports that are out there. So let's get straight into it. I'd like to invite Karen to turn on her camera and join us this morning. Karen Hernandez, good morning to you. Nice to see you. How are you?
Good, thank you, Jonathan. Hello, everyone.
There are lots of companies within the Enterprise Ireland stable, as we know, and they all do a wide variety of different things. But they have all been hit by this at the same time. It was this weird, unique, perfect storm. What kind of challenges have you seen? As I mentioned, the common themes. What has come up from those companies as a result of HR, people management during COVID?
So, Jonathan, in Enterprise Ireland, we work with a wide range of companies across many different sectors and stages of growth. And the COVID pandemic has impacted on companies in many different ways. So, for example, some of our client companies will have shut down their operations entirely. Others will have moved to a reduced workforce, and others will have moved to reduced remote working. So the challenges that companies are facing now as they return employees back into the workplace will be different. But that being said, there tend to be a kind of a number of key opportunities or key considerations that companies will need to address in order to put a plan in place to ensure an effective and safe return to the workplace.
And we've kind of bunched them into 4 different groups here, haven't we? So what are the 4? I mean, people can see them on the screen, but you might talk us through them a little bit.
Yeah, so I guess the first one that employers need to think about is to consider the health, safety and well-being of their staff. So the HSA have recently published a return to work safety protocol, And this is a very, very useful guide and outlines a number of measures that companies need to put in place in order to ensure the health and safety of their employees. So it looks at measures that companies need to implement, such as a risk assessment and putting together a COVID-19 business response plan, and also asking employees to complete a return to work form prior to returning to the workplace.
And then there's the issue of how you communicate with your staff, because if you're used to dealing with them sitting in front of you, it became very complicated, didn't it?
Absolutely. So again, this protocol really identifies the communication and engagement of staff as being a critical element of the return to the workplace. So there are a number of measures that the HSA guidelines are asking companies to put in place around communication, and these are to put a COVID-19 response team in place. So this COVID-19 response team will be responsible for putting together the COVID business response plan and the implementation of it. Again, organisations and companies need to appoint at least one worker representative, and this worker representative will work with that COVID response team to engage employees with any of the changes that need to take place as a result of COVID-19. And also training needs to happen for all staff. So companies should be looking at how do they induct staff back into the business, looking at all the policies and processes that will have changed and making sure that employees are well aware of them.
Obviously, companies have been through a whole lot of problems. It's not just a HR problem coming back in. There was the wider economic challenge, and the fact that companies have had to pivot, companies have had to stop doing what they were doing before, and they've just been hit with this wall that they previously had never even considered in the first place. And that's given challenges up for resourcing and restructuring.
Absolutely, Jonathan. So given the physical distancing guidelines, it's highly unlikely that any company will be bringing back their full complement of workers in the first instance. So companies will have to consider their resourcing requirements in line with obviously their business plans, but also in line with their employees. So for example, some companies may have groups of employees with underlying health conditions who may be deemed vulnerable workers, and perhaps they will not be brought back in the first instance. What we would be saying to companies is that good practice says that resourcing challenges or resourcing decisions should be made on objective selection criteria, and companies really need to be mindful of decisions they make so as not to either directly or indirectly discriminate under any of the 9 grounds of the Employment Equality Act.
Okay, and of course, I mentioned it, the 4 letters. I think it's the 3rd anniversary or the 4th anniversary of GDPR, but it had a birthday recently that got overlooked tragically for GDPR. It hasn't gone away, but it's become more difficult, and the risk has become a little bit greater because of the fact that the workforce is spread.
Absolutely. So employers really need to consider the types of data they hold on their employees. And the HSA protocol is asking companies to take contact logs for tracing purposes. Also, there may be a need for some companies to undertake temperature testing. And there's a wealth of health information contained in the return to work form. So what we would be saying is that companies need to be very mindful of their obligations under GDPR and data security. Make sure that any data that they take on behalf of their employees can be deemed reasonable, and the data is stored in a confidential and secure manner.
It was funny because I just happened to call into my local church the other day when I was passing by, and there was a big form written down because they were trying to do the right thing with contact tracing, but everyone's name and phone number was just sitting there in the open, and I was kind of going, I wonder what GDPR would make of that. Karen, you're going to stay with us because we're going to come back to you a little bit later on to talk about the type of supports that are available from Enterprise Ireland. But at this point, I'd like to bring in our other 2 speakers, Fredericka, Sheppard and Joyce Rigby, who are both joint managing directors with Voltedge, who are a wonderful HR consultancy in this space, dealing with all of these challenges that have been thrown up. Good morning to you both, Fredericka and Joyce.
Good morning, Jonathan. Good morning, Karen.
Don't forget, we are looking for your questions. The Q&A is over on the right-hand side of the panel here, so if you can click into that, you can ask questions that will come through. And as I said, there are unique things and challenges for your company. You can ask them, or you can refer to some of the more global challenges that are out there. But let's deep dive into the the 4 things that Karen has identified for us as the key questions that have to be addressed by people as they are now getting their business up and running and their offices up and running. And I'm going to begin, Joyce, with you. We start with the companies to make sure they take into account health and safety. It's very important. The HSA, the Health and Safety Authority, have published these return to work protocols. I mean, like everything else, you look at it and you go, whoa, where am I going to start? But there are key things that need to be addressed.
Yes, and we have been getting really good guidance, Jonathan, from both the HSA, the HSE and gov.ie with regard to returning to work safely. There are a list of essentials, and I suppose what I'd say to all the companies is you need to look at these and say, what is reasonable and appropriate for my company? I mean, some companies will have different needs. A manufacturing facility is very different to a tech company office. So we need to be reasonable in our approach, but we also have to make sure we're providing a safe and good employment place for our employees. So there's a few important points we need to go through, really, that the employer must do as they start to bring employees back. One is develop your COVID-19 response plan. And that's really putting together your team and also the plan that you're working on to respond to COVID and how it's affecting your workplace and your employees. Carry out a full risk assessment of your workplace and your workforce to understand what are the risks or the potential risks that you're going to have to deal with. Ensure that an appropriate prevention and control measures are put in place following the risk assessment. So you'll have actions that will come out of that risk assessment. Then we've some specific things that we have to do with employees. There's a pre-return to work form that must be completed by all employees at least 3 days before they return to work. And that is dictated. It's very important that we do that. And it'll give us good insight into how the employee is making sure that they are fit to return to work. There's essential COVID-19 training that every employer should be doing as well, and that is really covering off on the whole hygiene in terms of dealing with COVID-19, how to ensure that we don't pass it on, how we can work in a safe environment and make sure we're not dealing with COVID in any way. And then there's also contract tracing, and that has also been dictated to us. We need to ask employees to look at who they're interacting with during the day and actually log that. The other thing that's really important is, and Karen touched on this, is the worker representative or worker representatives. You need to either appoint or elect a person, and often enough they'll be the health and safety representative, could be someone like that in the organisation already, and they will really be checking everything and making sure that the company is compliant. The other thing would be just general communication. I mean, there's a huge amount of work here, so we need to be constantly communicating, and this is all going to change and change rapidly going forward.
Yeah, and I suppose that's the important point, isn't it? That you may put a lot of effort into reopening your business and have done so, and then a week later they might change the rules and something might have happened that can cause you to change it. This has to be flexible, doesn't it?
Absolutely, because if we look at, there's a few things. I mean, the 2 meter rule, will it go to 1 meter? The masks, we're certainly going to be wearing masks in public environments, but will we decide to do that in the work environment? Some employers are thinking of temperature checking, others aren't. So there's quite a lot of things that each employer has to think about for themselves and make sure that it's appropriate and reasonable to put those actions into place if they want to do so.
Now, there's nearly 200 people watching us right now, so some of them will be members of GAA clubs, as I am, and they will have been filling in this form and this protocol. So there's a lot to be, I know it looks onerous when you see the list that's on the screen there. It does look quite onerous, but a lot of it in June of 2020 now actually makes a lot of sense. So, you know, this would have been harder to do, I would imagine, in March. It's less hard to do in June.
Yeah, and of course we have companies who've been working on essential services right through. And if you think about some of the pharmaceutical manufacturing and food manufacturers, they have been working continuously. And in fairness to them, they have been really driving best practice, and some of the thinking that's come out of what we have now in this protocol has come from really good practices from both Irish and global companies, which is really good.
Let's talk about the staff, because that's the human element in all of this.
Yeah.
We know, everybody knows that this has increased stress levels. There's nobody in the country whose stress hasn't been affected by this. And they might be stressed for any number of reasons. They might be trying to homeschool. They might be trying to build up the courage to go back out because they've been anxious about that. Then there are others who are worried about their future, that whether the company is going to be able to sustain their job in the long term. Employers have a lot to worry about, but that's probably one of the things they should worry about more, because those people are the ones that they're relying on to keep the wheels on the wagon, so to speak. So how conscious do they need to be about the stress levels of people as they return to the workplace?
Yeah, I think it's really important that all our companies are thinking about this. Now, we have to say that most employees have really stepped up, and a lot of them are working remotely for the first time, and the data we're receiving is showing that there's tremendous work going on, that people are juggling child minding. They're maybe working in not ideal situations in terms of an apartment with 4 other guys or whatever it is. They may be minding other vulnerable people at home. So if you think about it, we've all gone through major stress, whether it's to do with COVID or the circumstances we find ourselves in. And there has been such radical change that an employer has to take that on board and understand that every employee is reacting differently. Now, some employers have what we call an EAP, or an employee assistance program, in place. And these programs offer expert support on perhaps mental health issues, financial issues, interpersonal issues, whatever it might be, and employees can avail of those services confidentially. Now, not all our companies have that. However, we can do lots of other things. We can run wellbeing sessions. There's actually some really good freely available sessions. Some of them are through gov.ie, and it's called In This Together. So if you look that up, there's some really nice stuff on their website. Also, HSE has a mental health section, which is really good as well. And the Enterprise Ireland guide that you'll have access to after this webinar gives some really helpful tips on how employees can manage best in this situation. And we include a couple of ideas, such as a buddy system, which can be really nice for people working remotely. But I think once an employer... Yep.
Sorry, Joyce, go on.
Once an employer is aware that they have employees who are going through different phases of concerns and worries, they need to really think about this and keep communicating with them. It's vital that when you're thinking about bringing employees back, maybe you're thinking about a blended work option. As Karen said, we won't be able to get everyone back in the offices. So maybe some people are going to have to stay working at home indefinitely. Others will come back on a part-time basis, whatever that might be. You need to talk about this to individuals and see what fits their needs and how they can cope with it. Strong communication will get you that buy-in and support from employees, which is really important. And, giving them an update and maybe photos on what you're doing and how it's going to be phased, and getting them to give their input as well will really help you get to a stage where you're running the business better after returning to work.
Just linking the first 2 questions, I mean, it is a very good idea to employ that the worker representative is there, because that forms that link, that connection. An employer might say, well, what happens if the worker representative comes to me with a suggestion that I cannot possibly implement, and there is a knock-on effect? How do you deal with that?
I think that the employer has to look at this as a reasonable and practical and appropriate response to the COVID-19 issues. And they do need to follow the protocol, but there are some things that they will not have to do that other employers will. So, for example, temperature checking. We'll see that happening in a lot of manufacturing sites already. But if you work in an office with 5 people and everyone has signed their pre-return to work form, is it going to be logical and helpful to have a temperature check and someone being trained to do that, trained to manage the materials, the information they're getting? I think that's a call an employer has to make. So I think being reasonable is key. And if a worker representative has a genuine issue, they should go back. They can ask the HSA, they can ask for information or support on this from other experts. But ultimately, it's really ensuring that you're providing a safe working environment for your employees. And I think a lot of common sense will come out of that.
Absolutely. Let's talk about communication and engagement. The protocol, Fredericka, mentioned some of those new roles. And I suppose there are different elements, not just the representative, but there are lots of things we need to do. And what actions do what action do companies need to take to make sure these roles are filled as we continue this road back to work?
Yeah, absolutely. And as Joyce was referencing there, you know, the COVID response plan will be really important. So that will require a COVID response team to conduct that risk analysis and to review the gap analysis associated with it to drive forward the changes that are needed. So we would see the response team really comprising of at least one member of the senior management team, the health and safety representative, the worker representative, and a member from facilities management and operations, obviously HR and IT. Now, depending on the size of your organization, these might be roles held by the same person or a number of similar people, but you need to appoint, I suppose, proportionate to the size of your organization. And once you conduct that risk assessment, you'll actually understand just how much of a gap is there to actually ensure the workplace is a safe environment. So the worker representative, as Joyce was saying, really is called out in the government protocol. So that's a really important role, and it is a broad term. So it can be an employee, but it covers worker in general. So it is to encompass all of the other stakeholders as well. So it'll be important to appoint somebody with suitable skills to represent employees in the design, management and communication of the response plan. And you know, as I say, different companies are going to have different resource needs in relation to this. And you know, interfacing with third-party contractors, looking at the office layout, the flow of communication, really, really important. So ensuring that the company has taken all of the necessary steps to safeguard the health, safety and well-being of staff is what's really important by this response team.
It's interesting that you referenced there on the slide employer brand and reputation. You know, we came through a really dramatic crisis, at which point like almost all bets were off, and that was right across society. We're emerging from that now again. And yeah, there's potential implications, I suppose, if you don't do this right, that you might get the reputation as the company who's loose and free with the rules. So you have to make sure that everything is communicated from the leadership team down to get everybody on board.
Absolutely, Jonathan. Yeah, and you know, we need to reset, I suppose, our daily routine. So managers really need to design and facilitate this. So especially in the short term, you know, while staff are doubling up with responsibilities, working remotely, caring for people, dealing maybe with underlying medical conditions, it's a time that we really need to try and reconnect with our corporate values and consider our employer brand. What does it stand for? So live our values at a time like this, but align what you do now to what you want to be recognized for the future, I think is really important. And authentic leadership is, you know, what employees are really looking for from management. And of course, there's a role for boards of directors and advisory boards, because good corporate governance is really important. Knowing that you are gathering the right data, making good informed decisions, and that there's good financial management in place. So you de-risk the business generally so that you can actually build for a future.
I just see more people have joined us on the webinar in the last few minutes. So good morning to you. You're very welcome. If you want to ask a question, you can do so using the panel over on the, well, it's on the right-hand side of my screen. It's probably below you if you're watching on a mobile, but it's there somewhere, and you can click on questions and you can throw a question in. Some of them have come in already, which we will get to in just a minute. The workplace after this is going to be different, and we don't know how long it's going to be different for. Some of the changes, as we know, Fredericka, are going to become permanent. And I mentioned the building that I'm in here, that you go up one stairs and down the other. One of those stairs was previously banned from use. Amazingly, it's been brought back into use now. You know, the kitchen is closed. You have a one-way system walking through some of the places where you could roam free like wildebeest before. All of this is very unusual, but communicating these changes is important, so that people don't come in and automatically go up the wrong stairs and either get themselves into trouble or feel bad that they've broken the rule accidentally.
Absolutely, yeah. So again, like Joyce referenced it, Karen referenced it, communication really, really critical. And what we need to do is make sure we're proactively communicating. So once that worker representative is feeding in and contributing to the response team, you'll be gathering an awful lot of information. And again, the pre-return to work form, you're going to be gathering information from staff. Take all of that into account, but really important to proactively communicate with stakeholders. And the guide sets out really nice step-by-step approach. We give some sample policies. We also give some guidance on all the different types of communication, the methods of communicating. So set expectations. You know, you mentioned even this morning coming into the office, you know, what to expect when you come into the office. What will day one be like? Where will I enter? Where will my workstation be? Has it changed? Who else is coming back to the workplace? What happens for lunch or break time? Do I need to bring something with me and eat outside or go somewhere else? Like all of the facilities really within the workplace are going to be changed. And so change is difficult. So it's a time for management really to help people through that change process, map it out, communicate it, and communicate again. So you can't communicate enough really in a case like this.
Tony Holohan, in a press conference the other night, he was asked a question about the pubs reopening, and he said that, well, if you walk into a pub and you feel it's unsafe, then you walk back out again. Very hard for an employee to do that. And again, that's where this fully interactive system, the flexible system, comes in. If your employee tells you that they're not comfortable doing something, you have to listen, don't you?
Completely. Like, take account of that. Collaboration and consultation is going to bear fruit for you for sure. You want to know if there are risks. You want to know if staff have levels of anxiety, because you want to have your staff working in a safe environment. That is your primary responsibility as an employer. And if you are engaging with them, if you are asking them for their input, you are maybe conducting staff surveys or pulse surveys on an ongoing basis, you will get greater engagement, greater cooperation, and we know that productivity and performance increases in an environment where there is good staff engagement.
And the old adage, never waste a good crisis. You have down there learning and development. We are learning things about how people respond and where people's strengths may lie, and indeed where some weaknesses may be that you wouldn't have previously identified. You can use this to invest in the future to make your company more robust. I mean, if we weather this winter, then we can summer anywhere, as that famous Healy quote goes. So, you know, can you use this opportunity?
Oh, for sure. You know, I think we're seeing all sorts of new skills being needed at a time like this. Resilience has never been more important. What managers do and how they engage with staff is different. So we need to support managers to actually develop those skills and capabilities, invest in your management team so that they can manage through this process, but give people the skills they need. You talked earlier about pivoting your organization. The chances are you might be offering your service or your product in a different way. You might be redesigning what it is you do, and your marketplace has changed. So support your staff in actually acquiring the skills you need for the future. Invest in your people, and you will get that return back, obviously through performance, but also through engagement.
Let's talk about resource planning, because this is one of the more tricky elements at the moment. Companies have been through a nightmare, and it's funny, some companies have traded through and haven't really affected. Other companies, as you say, pivoted and they ended up doing something differently, but that meant that they had a constant stream of income. And then some companies just fell off a cliff because what they were doing was no longer applicable in a COVID era, and they had to reduce employees. They had to take advantage of the various state schemes that are there. And of course, everyone's now looking back at them going, well, what's going to happen next? What should you do now? What do you advise those employers to do? Because there are those who will have to make difficult choices.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I have a sensor light in my office here. So the short-term plan certainly was all around consolidating and cost saving and making sure that we were using the government subsidies, and they've been really a lifesaver for so many companies. And so, you know, now that we know that the scheme is extended to the end of August, it really does give us a chance to take stock and actually look at what is happening in the marketplace, look at what we need to do with our business. And I suppose there's a few things to consider in relation to the next stage of longer term planning. So if your medium to long term plans indicate that you need to restructure, or you need to maybe reduce your headcount, or look at a different skill set within the business, then all of the best practice policies associated with redundancy comes into play. So consultation, fair selection, even during this time of pandemic. So pay close attention to what is set out in the legislation. The guide that we've provided has some really good guidelines and checklists and samples on selection process and consultation. So do reference the guide to help you with that. But I think the other side to think about as well is there is going to be a psychological impact. You know, if you are going to be making staff redundant, obviously there's a financial impact because you have to be able to compensate sustainably. But also the staff who are staying potentially are going to have an impact in relation to their colleagues that they've been working alongside. You know, these have probably been talent that you have fought hard to get. And the other side, of course, is any of your staff who might be on work permits or visas, just check to make sure that their terms are safeguarded as well, you know, so that they're not put at risk.
I mean, it's interesting, and again, you draw attention to the fact that legislation here hasn't changed. So therefore, the same rules around this area apply. So if you have to make a decision, the crisis won't cover you if you don't do it right.
Yeah, completely. So again, we would say, look, the first thing to do is look at your business plan, realign and reset your company goals to make sure that you're starting off from an informed decision. The second thing then is to really look at your skills and capabilities. What do you need now for the future in order to deliver these new set of goals that are required? Thirdly, consider that blended model that Joyce referenced. You know, you're probably going to be working in a different way. There'll be some people coming to the workplace and some people will continue to work remotely, or juggling it, a bit of both. And so that blended working model is probably going to be a feature for us for the future. Fourthly, the management capability. Make sure you're investing so that the behaviors that you're nurturing within your management team are the right ones, so that they can manage the challenges that all staff face in this regard. And then finally, look at, I suppose, remember, you know, what you do, remember work is what you do and not where you go. So again, you know, be open-minded about this and look collectively at it.
Enterprise Ireland companies are on a trajectory normally. They're heading forward. They're looking to the future. They're expanding. They're looking at new markets. Panic is never a good thing. And if you make a decision in a panic, you might find in 6 months' time, oh, I really wish I'd kept John, because John would have been the man to solve this. But now, look, guess what? John is working somewhere else. How do you manage that panic?
Yeah, I think that's, you know, taking a planned approach to it is really, really important. And I think if you're starting off with that business plan, reassess what your business is offering and reassess your marketplace. And, you know, you're right, in a crisis, there's always an opportunity. We set up Voltedge during the last crisis in 2011, and here we are almost 10 years later. So I think—
They said you were mad.
What?
And they said you were mad for setting something up in 2011. Yeah.
Absolutely. But you're right, there's always an opportunity in a crisis. And so evaluate what you believe the market is going to do or what is happening, but you need to keep it under review, because look, we're in a situation that none of us have experienced before. It's a global pandemic. So what happens in China, what happens in the US is going to impact us. So we can only manage what we know. But if you're actually making good informed decisions, financial management, of course, is really, really important. Leaving yourself with a healthy balance sheet to make good informed decisions throughout this process will be very important.
Joyce, if I can come back to you to talk about data protection and GDPR. Again, I suppose people would have been forgiven for being a little free and easy with some of the elements of GDPR in the last couple of months. But again, in the same context, the rules haven't gone away, and they're very serious. So let's talk about temperature checks, for example. Medical data is the most sensitive of data. If you take someone's temperature when they walk through the door, you are taking technically something that is very sensitive to them, because if their temperature was elevated, a level of opprobrium could be attached to them, and you may be responsible for putting that in some way into the public domain, even if it's within the office place. The obligations under GDPR remain, and you can't, like, I suppose, redundancy, you can't use the crisis as an excuse if you're found to be in breach.
No, you're absolutely right. Data security and GDPR haven't gone away, Jonathan, and we do need to be very aware that some of the things we're doing during COVID are absolutely exceptional. We would never have asked an employee to fill out a form like this pre-return to work form, asking them, are they fit to work, or do they have any vulnerable people around them, or do they have personal vulnerabilities? We would never have asked them that. However, we have got some clearance in terms of approval that there are things that we do have to do, and two of those are the pre-return to work form, and the other is contact tracing. But in saying that, we have to abide by the GDPR rules in terms of how we collect that data and how we store it and how we manage it. So really important that we have someone who knows what they're doing when they're collecting data, where are they storing it, and how long do we keep it. So for an example is the pre-return to work form. How long do you keep that? Well, there's no strict guidance on this, but what we're thinking is that you need to keep it for at least 2 periods of 2 weeks. So 4 weeks is the minimum, because that's the 2 weeks and 2 weeks that you'd have potential risk of COVID in the workplace. So that's what we're sort of thinking now, and that will probably come through as guidance going forward. The other thing would be, the temperature checking. We don't have any public health advice on that yet. There are quite a number of companies doing it, but they must be really careful about how they do it. Who's taking the temperature checks? Are they trained? How are they storing that information? And how long do they keep it for? And also, how do they use it? So, for example, if I jog to work, which is highly unlikely, I might add, but if I jog to work and I arrive in a serious heat, I may not pass the temperature check. So how do you evaluate against that? So you have to be very clear in how you deal with these issues. Okay. The other
sorry, go on.
Yeah, the other personal data that you might have might be that an employee has told you that they have really quite a significant vulnerability with regard to COVID that you would never hear otherwise. So you have to be very careful about that. And one last thought is, if someone does, God forbid, get COVID in your office, in your site, it's really important that you keep that confidentiality at all times. You must not tell people that someone has got COVID. You can obviously tell them that there may be a risk and that you're putting in place risk measures to ensure people are safe. But it's really important that we go back and remember our data security and GDPR guidelines.
The technology space is evolving very quickly here, because I think that initially a lot of it is going to be pen and paper, and you're filling it in, and there's books and there's forms, and that's going to become very unwieldy very, very quickly. Should companies be looking at software to do this? Because a lot of the software that is available would probably be compliant, but you have to make sure the obligation is on you that compliance is in place.
Yeah, and what we're hearing, yesterday there was a lot of information on the news about a potential app that's coming down the line that the HSE may be introducing. And, that would make life a lot easier for people if they're going to be tracking people that they've met and seen recently. But if that is the case, the company has an obligation, firstly, to ensure that the use of an app like that is completely confidential and safe for their employees, that they know that the information is stored securely, and that there's no threat of a breach going forward. So there's a whole risk assessment that needs to be done before you would introduce anything like that. And some employees may just say, no, I'm not doing that. Some of us are phobic to technology. Others will be delighted because they feel it'll save them time and energy. So there's a whole issue in terms of bringing that on board and educating people.
It's funny, again, I go back to filling in the GAA form the other night, thinking, would I have filled this in voluntarily 6 months ago and given them my date of birth, given them my address, my air code? I probably wouldn't, but then, you know, rules are rules, as we found during this crisis. There's a question in there from Emer, actually, which I might put to you, Joyce, before we move on. How extensive does the contact log have to be? Is it just for working hours? What happens if I met a friend for lunch? Do I have to put that into the working contact log?
Okay, well, the employer really only has responsibility for the working hours of the person when they're in the building and when they're physically on site. Okay, if they're working remotely, they could still do it as well. But ultimately, it's up to the individual how they log this. It's very important that we consider the logging of only within 2 meters and over 15 minutes, because if we don't make sure that we're logging against that, we could effectively be telling the HSE tracing guys that the whole company has been in touch with you. So it's really important that we use the tracing log accurately. And a lot of companies are working with teams and keeping teams together and keeping them apart so that if there is a case or even a risk of a case, that they're only impacting on maybe one team and all the rest of the company is fine. So how you manage this is really quite important, and employee education is vital on this.
And again, it's just an area where you have to be careful because it could come back in some way and have implications. Karen, if I can come back to you, Enterprise Ireland, as I said, you're a very broad church. You've got companies doing all sorts of different things, different sizes, different shapes, different management structures, and all that goes with it. They do look to you guys in Enterprise Ireland for support. What is available for people right now in this human resource space?
Okay, Jonathan, well, we recognise we're getting a lot of questions in from clients, and we're hearing a lot of challenges around the return to work process. So we've been working with Voltedge, with Fredericka and Joyce over the last month or so to draw together some best practice around each of the 4 areas that we've discussed today, and those are available within a return to work guide, which we're launching later on this afternoon. So anyone who's listening in today will automatically get a link to that guide, and if you're listening in on a recorded webinar, you'll be able to download it via the Global Ambition website. So essentially this guide goes into a lot of good practice around each of the 4 areas. It has a range of templates that companies might find useful, such as the risk assessment template, a return to work form, which companies can download and use as appropriate within their business. And just in terms of financial supports, then we have recently introduced a lean business continuity voucher. So companies today might be aware this exists, but for those that don't, this voucher is a support for companies. It's worth up to €2,500. It's for companies to use towards advisory support or training support for any aspect of their operations that may have been impacted from COVID-19. And a lot of companies are using it to put in place the structures and the systems that they need to return employees back to the workplace safely. And again, that's available via our website, and we'll be sending a link out to all participants later on today. So in a general sense, what I would just recommend that clients do is just get in touch with their development advisor. We have a range of supports. Again, we've mentors, we've got consultancy supports, we've got some management development supports as well. Again, those will differ according to the stage of growth companies are at, perhaps, or maybe the size of company. So talk to your development advisor and they'll be able to bring you through the range of supports available. And again, for Leo clients listening today, again, talk to your local enterprise office.
Yeah, but I suppose the most important thing is don't let a problem build, because if you let a problem build, it becomes harder to deal with. If you get the support in early, then you're going to be able to at least listen to that and make a decision in the round, rather than dealing with the many multitudes of crises that this entire event has thrown up to us. I'm going to ask people at the last opportunity now for the question and answer session, because we're going to get into it. We need to be wrapped by 11 o'clock. So if you have a question, please don't be shy. Put it on to the system using the panel either to the right of the screen, which is that way, sorry, No, it's that way. I was right the first time. And below. Sorry, it's very confusing. I keep forgetting that this is mirrored. We want to go to some of the questions that have come in already, and I'll throw them out to you, Joyce and Fredericka. I'll let you decide who's best to answer this. What should I do if an employee refuses to come into work? They're not ill, they're not vulnerable, they just don't want to come back to the workplace.
Okay, I'll take that one. I suppose one of the things is to talk to them. Firstly, really double check that they don't have any issues that they haven't told you about. The pre-return to work form will facilitate this as well. Secondly, talk to them about their reasons. Is it just a worry about COVID? You can talk to them about all the changes you've made in the workplace, what you're doing, the risk assessment, send photos maybe of the work environment so they can understand what you're doing in terms of the area that they work in and their desk area. If it's financial and they're on the pandemic, you should stress that if you have work for them, they should be returning to work and they're obliged to return to work. So you would set a date with them and run on that basis. Some employees are definitely going to have childcare issues, and that's going to be ongoing for quite some time. So maybe looking at a blended return to work, looking at a phased return might be really helpful there as well.
I'm guessing now is not the time to be, I suppose, completely and utterly rigid in your approach. That if there is flexibility, there will be a reward eventually. But there is an obligation on both parties to try and come to an arrangement.
Yeah, I mean, we have to run our businesses. There's no question about that. But we do have to be sensitive and much more empathetic, I think, at the moment to the issues that our employees are experiencing. And it's sometimes hard to know what they are going through. So really, the manager should be talking to their direct employees, but it really needs to be an interaction. And I think it's not the time to be just saying this is what we're doing and let's do it. You need to be talking about it and come to a collaborative response.
Anne has just sent in a question to us here. If your employees have worked through this because of the fact that we were deemed an essential service, do you have to complete these forms? I'm presuming she means you have to go through what might be argued to be this palaver, if arguably they haven't gone to that level of detail before now.
Yeah, I'll take that. Yes, Anne, I think that the pre-return to work form is it's still important because there's going to be information there that you will gather that will be very important for you to have. You also need to look at the induction training that staff need to undertake, and that is in relation to COVID, understanding everything about the condition itself. And also, I think just refamiliarizing them with the steps that the organisation is taking. So the response plan will be set out as well. So making sure that you're actually communicating that. So yes, go through all of those steps still, even if your staff have been coming to work throughout the pandemic.
And of course, this is an evolving situation. It might be different in a few weeks' time. And if you don't have the groundwork done now, then you might fall foul at a later point, even if you are an essential service. This is an interesting one because this comes up all the time. I'm sure that you and Voltedge have dealt with this before. I would like to ask why obligations around health and safety and COVID-19, if it is planned that our employees will continue to work from home for the foreseeable future. Now, that might be from Twitter or Facebook, I'm not sure, but it is a huge conundrum. The idea, what happens if an employee falls over the cable in their home office because they were scrambling to get to a phone call? Am I liable? Am I responsible? How do we deal with that now that there's so many working from home?
Yeah, and I think it's really pertinent. We will have so many people working partly or fully from home indefinitely. And the employer has an obligation, and it actually goes back to the Health, Safety and Welfare Act 2005. We have to revert back to the original safety measures that have been brought in over the last few years. So we're basically saying, listen, if you're going to work remotely, you need to have a safe place and you need to show your employer that you're working in a safe environment. So what we're suggesting, and there is a template in the guide that will help you on this, send in photos of your workstation, of where you're working, show that you don't have a clutter of wires hanging off that you're going to trip over, show that it's in a decent situation. You can do ergonomic checklists. There's quite a number of those available where the employee has to go through a checklist to check if they're in a safe environment and they've done all they need to do to ensure safety. you can provide them with training courses on ergonomics as well. And you should also make sure that you have those contact details that you need for the employee. So that's not only the employee, but their next of kin, and make sure that you have enough detail that you can contact them at any point. Other support that the employer is going to obviously think about, and this has been happening rapidly during COVID. Some employers have said, listen, I'll give you an allowance, go off and buy that table and chair and your screen holder, whatever it is you need, and they give you an allowance and you receipt that back. Other companies have said, listen, we have a supplier, these are the chairs, these are the items that we think you can buy, and you can purchase them through our supplier. So that's something well worth considering as well, because a lot of us are at the kitchen table and the ergonomics aren't great and we need support on that. So I think that's going to be more of an issue for some of the smaller companies going forward as they deal with employees who are staying put.
We'll go to the rapid fire round now. It's my favorite part because the clock is starting to come against us. Here's a good one from Dave. Is it sufficient for employees to take their temperature at home before leaving for the office, or does the employer have to do it?
I would say you have to evaluate the value of that, really. Is it of any relevance if they take it from their temperature when they're at home, bearing in mind that there's a journey to work? And as Joyce says, if you're jogging to work or you're cycling to work, it's not going to be maybe a relevant temperature anyway. So not necessarily. It mightn't be necessary for you to have a temperature check.
Yeah, it depends on the form. Okay, next question. What should I do if an employee is not attending virtual team meetings or always has their mute and camera button off during the call? We know the type of person we're dealing with here. We've seen them all on those Zoom calls. How can you, I mean, they might be up to absolute, they might be doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing, but by turning their camera off, it's hard to tell as an employer. What do you do in that scenario?
Yeah, actually, we've been suggesting that it might be a good idea to have a policy on remote working and how we use our videos and how we interact, because actually it's really important for us to see each other when we're remote working as well. If an employee is deliberately turning off their sound and their video, there could be a number of reasons. They could be embarrassed by the background that they have, and some of the media products, obviously you can put a false background, so make sure that they're aware of that. They could be worried about the kids or the dog barking the whole time in the background as well. So again, the mute may be necessary at times, but I think the important thing is that you expect them to engage with meetings, and even to say to them that this is our policy, we want to see people. We accept that you may not be dressed up to the nines all the time as we're working at home, but we do want to see you and see how you are and interact with you physically on a screen.
Okay, and last one to you, Fredericka. What happens if an employee refuses to work alongside a team member who has travelled abroad? What's my responsibility as the employer in that regard? Now, up to this point, there was a 14-day quarantine that had to go into anyway, so it's not really at risk because the employer couldn't bring somebody back within that 14-day period. But we've now got these air corridors that are opening up. Some people may go to other countries. That's been decided at Cabinet today. If somebody says, I don't want to sit next to Fredericka, I've nothing against her personally, but I know she's been abroad and I'm uncomfortable.
Yeah, and look, you're right. We're going to see an awful lot more of these sort of questions coming up. So again, we would say map this out in your policy, whether you need to review your annual leave policy to say, you know, how will you take your holidays, will you travel? Because for personal travel, you know, if somebody is going to go abroad, the Department of Foreign Affairs will give guidelines on what happens when they come back. But, you know, you're still going to need them to do a pre-return to work form. So even when they've been on holidays, you'll need them to complete that. You'll evaluate the risk again. You'll take them through, obviously, the return to work plan, all right? And the thing is, it's important, obviously, for the staff who are in the workplace and maybe uncomfortable about somebody coming back into the workplace, that they're reassured that you've done everything that's appropriate to evaluate a risk of somebody who's been away. So whether it is personal travel or business travel, the protocol with regards to the 2-week isolation is moving. You know, that's not always necessarily going to be in place. But again, there is personal responsibility that all of us need to take to ensure that we're safeguarding ourselves as well.
Okay, and personal responsibility is key to the entire success of us keeping this particular virus at bay. The clock is against us, so I have 30 seconds for each of you to just tell us what you think is the most important takeaway from today. Joyce, I'm going to begin with you in 30 seconds. What do you want people to take away from this conversation more than anything else?
Okay, I think complete your COVID-19 response plan. Make sure you've done the risk analysis and put appropriate actions in place. Follow the returning to work protocol essentials, and make sure that you're able to change. Everything's going to change going forward. It's a movable feast here. We need to be able to be rapid and change rapidly, change policies rapidly, change what we're telling our employees rapidly. So reasonableness, fairness and transparency as well are keywords.
Fredericka, she did very well for 30 seconds there, so the pressure is on you. What's your 30 seconds worth of advice?
Okay, remember your people remain your most valuable asset. Take good care of them. Consult, communicate and collaborate. Can't do enough of that. Reset business goals, realign what it is people are doing to the business goals. Support employees to achieve, so continue to invest in training. And finally, lead your team through this. It's a time to live your values, dust them down and be a model member of staff.
Karen, they've put tremendous pressure on you because they both did it in 30 seconds. So the final word on this, Karen Hernandez of Enterprise Ireland.
Okay, so what I would ask companies to do is to download the Return to Work Guide, which we'll have available later on today, and to really look through the advice and the guidance there and all of the tools and templates to put your plan in place to start the process of returning your employees back into your workplace. And again, connect in with your development advisor. There's a wealth of experience that your development advisor and your local enterprise office will have around returning to work, and they'll be able to best guide you in terms of the appropriate financial and non-financial supports that can help you.
Okay, Karen, thank you so much. You did it as well. Well done. Excellent work on all the panel's part. Folks, it's been a fascinating insight into all the issues that can and have been arising. Joyce Rigby Jones and Fredericka Sheppard of Voltedge and Karen Hernandez of Enterprise Ireland. I'll leave you turn off your cameras and your mics there. Thank you very much for joining us throughout this webinar. Hopefully you have enjoyed it as well, as much as you can enjoy a conversation about something we really wish wasn't happening in any shape or form. But as we move through the phases and as we come out the far side of the challenge that is COVID-19, eventually we will look back on this and say that it did make us stronger. We will be making all of the slides available from today. Don't forget, you had the link on screen there, globalambition.ie/COVID-19. That will bring you all the resources that you need. Keep in contact with Enterprise Ireland. Take the advice that is there. You're not alone in the problems that you are facing. And as the old saying goes, a problem shared is a problem halved. Good luck with the next few weeks and whatever it may bring for you and your companies. Thank you for your attention today. And for me, Jonathan Healy, a very good morning.